Now, a new analysis shows that the 6-ton iconic altar stone at the heart of Stonehenge originated from northeastern Scotland rather than southwest Wales. The discovery shows that its construction was a far greater collaborative effort.
For 5,000 years, this monument has kept its mouth shut, swallowing every theory we threw at it and giving nothing back. And now something colder has crept into the story that shows something is wrong at the center of Stonehenge. For 100 years, we told ourselves a confident story about who built it and where the stones came from, and we taught it to our children as fact. Then the data arrived, cold and undeniable, and every word of that story began to fall apart. What is buried in that ground was never supposed to be there. The stone that came from the wrong country. Let me start with the discovery that broke the whole field open, because it is the most recent, and it is the one that should bother you the most. In August of the year 2024, a team of geologists published a finding in the journal Nature that quietly demolished a century of confident teaching. They had been studying the altar stone, the large gray-green slab lying flat at the dead center of Stonehenge, half buried beneath two fallen giants. For generations, every textbook lumped this stone in with the Welsh bluestones, and everyone moved on. Nobody questioned it. That was the mistake. The lead author was a young researcher named Anthony Clark at Curtin University in Australia, working alongside scientists from Aberystwyth and Adelaide. They did something the older archaeologists never could. They took the tiny mineral grains locked inside that sandstone, the zircon, the apatite, the rutile, and they read the ages of those grains like a barcode. The numbers came back strange. Most of the zircon was somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 million years old, with other minerals sitting around 450 million years. That fingerprint did not belong to Wales. It did not belong to southern England at all. It belonged to Scotland. The far northeast of Scotland, the Orcadian Basin, a place sitting at least 750 kilometers away from Salisbury Plain. Clark himself admitted he refused to believe his own data when it first landed on his screen. He said, and I am quoting him directly here, that there was no way it could be so distinctly Scottish, and yet time and time again the readings came back not from southern Britain. His colleague Richard Bevans at Aberystwyth said the findings overturned what had been thought for an entire century, that they could now say with confidence this iconic rock was Scottish and not Welsh at all. And another colleague, Rob Eichser at University College London, put it even more plainly. He called the findings genuinely shocking, and then he asked the two questions that nobody in that room could answer. Why, and exactly how, was a 6-ton stone dragged the entire length of Britain by people who supposedly had nothing more than antler picks and rope? Think about the terrain between those 2 points. Mountains, rivers, bog. The researchers leaned toward sea transport, hauling the stone down the coast on some kind of vessel, because the overland route seems almost impossible. A follow-up study modeled the ancient ice flows to check whether a glacier could have carried it, and the answer was no. The ice never offered a clean road south, which leaves us with the uncomfortable option. People did this. People chose this stone from a specific spot at the top of the country, and they moved it with intention across a distance that would exhaust a modern crew with cranes and engines and steel. And the researchers still cannot tell you the exact bed of rock it came from. They have narrowed it to the northeast of Scotland, but the precise quarry, the original outcrop where someone first looked at this slab and decided it was worth a journey of 750 kilometers, remains hidden. Bevans said the hunt is very much still on to pin that down. So even the discovery that overturned everything has only deepened the mystery rather than closing it. Now here is the part that turns this from a curiosity into something genuinely unsettling. The altar stone is not the only stone at Stonehenge that traveled. It is just the furthest. And when the analysis turned to the rest of the monument, the pattern that emerged suggested this was never one journey. It was a campaign that lasted longer than most civilizations. The giants, from the hills, So if the heart of the monument came from Scotland, where did the rest of it come from? And why does that answer make the whole thing harder to explain rather than easier? The enormous outer stones, the ones every photograph fixes on, are called sarsens. Each one stands over 20 feet tall and weighs somewhere near 25 tons, and the largest of them, the great upright of the central trilithon, rises higher still with several more feet buried underground to hold it steady. For a long time, we only knew they came from somewhere on the Marlborough Downs to the north, and that vagueness sat comfortably enough. Then, in the year 2020, a researcher named David Nash at the University of Brighton finally pinned it down. And the way he did it reads almost like a detective story. There was a missing piece. During restoration work back in 1958, a core sample had been drilled straight out of one of the sarsens, a long cylinder of stone, and a man named Robert Phillips took it home with him and eventually carried it across the Atlantic to America. For 60 years, that core sat in a private collection while archaeologists had nothing to physically test. Then, an old man now, living in Florida, Phillips decided to send it back. That single returned cylinder unlocked everything. Nash ran the chemistry and matched 50 of the 52 surviving sarsens to one place, a wooded patch called West Woods near Marlborough, roughly 15 miles north. He said it had been genuinely exciting to use 21st-century science to finally answer a question archaeologists had argued over for centuries. And you can hear the relief in that. But notice the gap in his own numbers. 50 of 52. 2 of those colossal stones did not match Westwoods at all. 2 of them came from somewhere we still have not found. That detail never makes the headlines, and it should, because it tells you these builders were not simply grabbing the nearest available rock and heaving it into place. They were selecting. They had reasons that mattered to them. They went out of their way for specific stones from specific ground. And we are only guessing at what made one outcrop worth the brutal labor and another worthless to them. There is a logic at work here, a set of choices, and we are reading only the surface of it. And the sarsens, as heavy as they are not even the stones that traveled the strangest road. For that, we have to go west, into Wales, and into a story that involves not just stones, but the dead who came with them, the Bluestones, and the people who followed them. Here is where the monument stops feeling like architecture and starts feeling like something closer to a migration, because the inner stones carry human remains in their story, and that changes the entire meaning of the place. Inside the Great Sarsen Ring sits a smaller circle of stones known as the Bluestones. Unlike the giant sarsens, these stones weigh up to about 4 tons each and did not come from the area around Stonehenge. Their true origin remained one of archaeology's biggest mysteries for decades. Then, in 1923, a geologist made an astonishing discovery. By carefully studying the unique mineral composition of the stones, he traced them to the rugged Preseli Hills in West Wales, nearly 140 miles away. That finding raised an even bigger question. If the stones really came from Wales, how did people living over 4,000 years ago move them such an incredible distance without wheels, cranes, or modern machinery? Years later, the mystery became even more exciting. Geologists Richard Bevans and Rob Eichser narrowed the source down to 2 specific locations, Carngoedog and Craig Rios I Fillin. This allowed renowned archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson and his research team to investigate the sites directly. What they uncovered was remarkable. Hidden among the rocky hillsides were unmistakable signs of ancient quarrying. They found stone hammer tools, carefully prepared working areas, and loading platforms carved into the landscape. These were not natural formations. They were clear evidence that people had deliberately extracted massive stone pillars here thousands of years ago. Parker Pearson's colleague, Josh Pollard, explained the surprisingly clever technique these ancient workers likely used. They drove dry wooden wedges into natural cracks in the rock. As the frequent Welsh rains soaked into the wood, the wedges slowly expanded, creating enormous pressure. Eventually, the stone pillars gently separated from the cliff face without the need for metal tools. It was a simple but brilliant method, relying not on strength alone, but on patience, careful planning, and a deep understanding of how stone behaves. But the dates threw up a riddle that still has not been solved. The charcoal at those quarries pointed to around 3,400 years before the Common Era, yet the blue stones do not appear at Stonehenge until centuries later. That gap led Parker Pearson to a theory that still divides the field today. He suggested the stones were first raised in a circle in Wales, a local monument standing for generations, and only later were they taken down and dragged all the way to Salisbury Plain. He found a possible candidate site called Waun Mon and proposed that migrants from Wales physically carried their sacred circle east to rebuild it as a piece of their own ancestry on new ground, as a way of bringing their identity and their ancestors with them. Other experts, including Timothy Darvill, pushed back hard, arguing the evidence at Waun Mon simply does not hold the weight of that claim. And that argument is still live right now. I am not going to pretend it is settled, because it genuinely is not. But what is not in dispute is the strangest piece of evidence of all, and it does not come from the stones. It comes from the bodies. In the year 2018, a study analyzed the cremated remains of 25 people buried in the earliest phase of Stonehenge. The chemistry locked in their bones, the strontium signature, told researchers where these people had actually lived during the final years of their lives. At least 10 of those 25 had not spent their lives on the chalk of Wessex at all. Their bones matched West Wales, the very region the blue stones came from. One of the scientists, Rick Schulting at Oxford, said it as plainly as it can be said. It was not only the stones that came to Stonehenge in those early phases, he said, but the people themselves, or in some cases just their ashes. So the stones and the dead traveled the same road, out of the same hills, to the same patch of ground. And once you accept that the monument was a destination for the deceased from its very first phase, you have to start asking what was happening inside that circle that made it worth carrying both rock and remains across an entire country. The answer that some researchers have reached for involves the one sense we almost never consider when we stand looking at these silent stones: the sound inside the circle. We always study Stonehenge with our eyes, and that may be the very reason we missed what it was actually built to do. Because the most careful modern study of the place was not about how it looked at all. It was about how it sounded. At the University of Salford, two acoustic engineers named Trevor Cox and Bruno Fazenda decided to do something nobody had managed before. They built a complete physical model of Stonehenge at 1/12 of its real size, every single stone in place as the monument stood around 4,000 years ago, using laser scans and three-dimensional printing to get the shapes exactly right. Then they placed it inside a special sound-proofed chamber and tested how sound actually behaved within those stones. They published the results in the year 2020, and the numbers are worth your full attention. Inside the circle, sound lingered. They measured a reverberation time of around 0.6 of a second and an amplification of speech of roughly 4 decibels. That does not sound dramatic written down on paper, but the meaning behind it is. Sound was enhanced only inside the ring. It did not carry outward to a crowd standing beyond the stones. There were no echoes bouncing back, because the inner stones scattered the reflections and absorbed them. Whatever was spoken, chanted, or drummed in that space stayed in that space, wrapping around the small group standing within it and going no further. Cox was very clear that he does not believe these acoustic effects were designed on purpose. He thinks the builders stumbled into them, and then, once they noticed how the place held and warmed a voice, they used it. And I think that is actually the more haunting version of events, not the less. It means a small gathering of people stood inside those stones 5,000 years ago and felt the air itself respond to them, felt their own voices come back richer and closer than anywhere in the open landscape outside, and they had no scientific explanation whatsoever for why. To them, it would not have felt like physics. It would have felt like the stones were alive and listening. And there is a related thread that deepens this even further, because the blue stones from Wales have a peculiar quality of their own. Researchers led by Paul Devereux tested the rocks along the Welsh Ridge. Those stones came from and found that a striking number of them ring when struck, producing a clear bell-like tone rather than a dull thud. There is even a Welsh village near the source whose name translates roughly to bellstones, and local accounts say blue stones were once used there as actual church bells. Several of the blue stones standing at Stonehenge still make muted ringing sounds despite being locked into the ground for thousands of years. So perhaps sound was one of the reasons these particular stones were prized above all the others available. It remains a theory rather than a proven fact, but it lines up uncomfortably well with everything else we are learning. I do want to clear away one thing you may have heard repeated: the claim that Stonehenge produced some hidden frequency that physically altered human consciousness. The careful measurements found ordinary reverberation, the same kind you would find in a stone room, not a mind-bending machine. And that particular legend does not survive contact with the actual evidence. The truth is quieter and, to me at least, far more interesting than the myth. These people built a space that gathered sound and held it close to the body, and they did it without any of the tools we would consider necessary to even attempt such a thing. This raises a question that the acoustics alone cannot answer. When exactly did all of this come together, and in what order? Because the timeline of the building itself hides a pattern that almost nobody ever talks about. The 5,000-year build. The story we grew up with is that Stonehenge was built. One project, one effort, one generation. Done. The reality is far stranger, because this place was assembled across a span of time so vast that the people who finally finished it were separated from the people who first began it by more generations than separate us today from the Roman Empire. Radiocarbon dating, taken from antler picks and other organic material left in the ground, lets us put real dates on the phases. Around 3,000 years before the Common Era, the first monument appeared, and it was not stone at all. It was a great circular ditch and bank dug out of the white chalk with antler picks, and just inside it, a ring of 56 pits we now call the Aubrey Holes, named after the 17th century antiquarian who first recorded them. And from the very start, this earthwork was a cemetery. English heritage estimates that as many as 150 people were buried here in cremated form, which would make it the largest late Neolithic burial ground in the entire British Isles. The dead were here long before the great stones ever rose into the sky. Then, around 2,500 years before the Common Era, came the transformation that gave us the silhouette everyone on Earth recognizes. The Sarsens were hauled in and raised. 5 towering trilithons, arranged in a horseshoe, and a ring of 30 uprights capped with a continuous circle of lintels running all the way around. And here the builders did something that still stops modern engineers in their tracks. They joined the stones using techniques borrowed directly from woodworking. They carved mortise and tenon joints, the kind you would cut to fit a wooden beam, so that each heavy lintel sat locked onto knobs carved into the tops of the uprights. They shaped the curving lintels of the outer ring with tongue and groove joints, so the stones interlocked neatly side to side. This is carpentry, performed in solid rock by people with no metal tools to cut it and no written plans to follow. After that came the bluestone rearrangements. The stones moved and reset more than once, in patterns we have never fully decoded to this day. And then, somewhere around 1,600 years before the Common Era, the last known work happened. 2 more rings of pits, the Y and Z holes, were dug carefully outside the Sarsen circle. And here is the detail that lingers in the mind. They were never filled with stones. They appear to have been dug for a plan that was started and then abandoned, an intention that died somewhere before it could ever be carried out. After that, the activity at Stonehenge fades slowly into silence. But buried inside this long timeline is something genuinely difficult to explain, a pattern hidden in the quality of the work itself. And when researchers lined the stones up against their dates, what they saw ran against everything we assume about how knowledge travels through time. The knowledge that moved the wrong way. We tell ourselves a comforting story about the past, that people slowly got cleverer over the centuries, each generation a little sharper than the last, all of us climbing steadily upward toward the present moment. When you study the precision of Stonehenge across its different phases, that comforting story starts to wobble badly. The earliest stonework at the monument shows the most care, the tightest fit, the finest dressing of the stone faces. The first builders shaped the contact surfaces of those sarcens with a smoothness that experimental archaeologists, working today with steel tools and power equipment and effectively unlimited time, have only managed to roughly approximate. Teams have spent months at a stretch trying to reproduce that early work and have come away with crude copies at best. People with antler and stone, working over 4,000 years ago, produced an original that we still cannot cleanly match with all our advantages. And the later additions, the stones placed by their own descendants, are not better than the early work. They are worse. The fit loosens, the precision drifts away. The arrow of skill, the thing we always assume points forward through time, seems here to be quietly pointing the other way. The sharpest hands were the first hands, and everyone who came after was working from an inheritance they clearly admired but could not equal. Now, I want to be careful and honest with you here because this is exactly where speculation likes to run completely wild. This decline does not prove a lost super-civilization, and it does not prove visitors from anywhere strange or distant. There are sober, human explanations for it. Perhaps the first builders had a depth of understanding, a teacher or a living tradition at its absolute peak, that genuinely faded as it was handed down across the centuries, the meaning thinning a little with every generation the way a song does when it is passed along too many times until the words still survive, but the reason behind them has quietly disappeared. Perhaps the people who began this knew exactly why each stone belonged in exactly one place, and the people who finished it only remembered that it should go roughly somewhere near there. Either way, the pattern is real, and it is uncomfortable to look at directly. These were not a people discovering how to do this and steadily getting better at it over time. By the evidence sitting in the stones themselves, they were a people slowly forgetting how, and racing against that forgetting to build the most permanent thing they could possibly imagine before whatever they knew slipped entirely out of their reach. And that single observation reframes the whole monument. It stops looking like the bright beginning of human knowledge and starts looking instead like the careful preservation of something already ancient, already fading, already half lost by the time the stones went up. Which leads us to the final and largest question of all. We have been treating Stonehenge as the thing itself, the centerpiece, the whole story standing alone on its plane. But when researchers finally pulled back and looked properly at the land surrounding it, they realized the stones were never standing alone at all. The wider design, and the things we still cannot answer. For all our focus on the circle, Stonehenge was only ever one piece of a far larger landscape, and the more of that landscape we slowly uncover, the clearer it becomes that we have badly underestimated the people who shaped every part of it. A few miles away sits a place called Durrington Walls, a vast settlement where the builders of Stonehenge most likely lived, while the great stones were going up over the years. Mike Parker Pearson's long-running excavation there found the remains of enormous seasonal feasts, pigs slaughtered in the dead of midwinter, animals brought in from right across Britain to be eaten together in one place at one fixed time of year. The teeth and the bones tell the story of people traveling great distances to gather, to labor, and to feast, all of it centered on this single stretch of open plain. This was not a lonely temple. It was the beating heart of a gathering place that pulled people from the whole island. Then, in the year 2020, a survey team led by Vince Gaffney at the University of Bradford found something that genuinely stunned even the most seasoned archaeologists in the field. Using geophysics and remote sensing rather than the spade, they detected a ring of massive pits encircling Durrington Walls, each one perhaps 10 to 20 meters across and several meters deep, forming a great circuit roughly 2 kilometers wide. Gaffney called the sheer scale of it without precedent anywhere in Britain, evidence of the complexity and ambition of these Neolithic communities and their deep desire to mark out their beliefs across the very land itself. Some other researchers have since raised fair questions about whether every single one of those pits is truly artificial, and that debate quietly continues. But the discovery reshaped how we see the whole region around the stones. Stonehenge was the heart of something genuinely enormous, far bigger than the circle alone. And this is where I have to be completely straight with you about what we actually know and what we do not. Because the honest position is more gripping than any invented certainty could ever be. We know where the stones came from now, with real precision, after centuries of confident guessing that turned out to be wrong. We know they moved people and the dead across the country alongside the rock. We know the monument was built and rebuilt patiently across 5,000 years, and that it held and warmed sound for those who stood inside it. What we still do not know is the why behind any single part of it. We cannot say why the altar stone was worth carrying all the way from the very top of Scotland. We cannot say for certain how those stones crossed mountains and rivers and open sea. We cannot say whether this place was a cemetery, a center of healing where the sick made pilgrimage, a calendar written carefully in rock, or all of those things woven together at once, because the experts themselves disagree sharply with one another, and the evidence honestly supports more than one answer. We cannot even say with confidence why, around 3,500 years ago, the people simply stopped, and the long influence of this place faded away as a new culture arrived with metal in their hands and individual ambition in their hearts, slowly replacing the communal world that had raised these stones together. What strikes me most of all, and what I keep coming back to whenever I think about this place, is the strange care of that ending. The final activity at Stonehenge does not look like panic or sudden flight at all. The fallen stones were set down deliberately and gently. Parts of the site were carefully covered over to protect what lay beneath them from the weather. It has the unmistakable feeling of people closing down something far too precious to break and far too complex to keep running, sealing it up against the centuries and quietly trusting it to whoever might come along thousands of years later with sharper eyes and better tools than they ever had. We are those people now. And the strange, humbling truth is that even today, with all of our science and all of our machines reading the language back out of the silent stone, the note those builders left behind for us turns out to be mostly a single question we still cannot answer. So I genuinely want to hear from you on this one. What do you truly believe Stonehenge was built for? And which of all these mysteries do you think we will finally crack first? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below.